said. Thank you for that answer. I appreciate that. Now, I have a question for you, David, and it's on our same theme about the formation of the echo chambers, but from a different kind of perspective here. Now, as a Republican congressman, you held some positions that were not in lockstep with the GOP, and I'm wondering if you could talk about the pull of the party identity and that party influence, financial and otherwise, in Congress today. How do you think that political party identity and their overall influence affects us, affects the public? Is that party influence part of how these echo chambers are formed?
Without a doubt, and if I could just speak for everybody in the audience, I think Patrick and I should just walk away because the brilliance we've just heard in the past 10 minutes, I mean, this is exactly right. This is the world in which, look, this is the world in which we're
working on social media, David. I can tell you.
No, but look, from the science of confirmation bias to where we are going in today's politics, this panel right now has turned into something that kind of burdens all of us. And what you just injected in the last question is the real life political structure that rigs the system towards special interest and money and tribalism. And so to your very specific question about how do you strike out independently, there is no infrastructure to support somebody who strikes an independent tone from their party. And that is one of the great challenges we face. And I've talked in the last 24 hours about every generation we have an opportunity, going back to TR with the Bull Moosers, through frankly Ross Perot and modern memory, to where we are now, that maybe there is an opportunity to build an infrastructure for people who challenge the current two-party system. But the reality is, if you go strictly to campaign finance, as somebody who challenged the party as a Republican, who has recently left the party, the greatest challenge to ballot access is I don't have a donor base. And we live in an environment where ballot access requires a donor base. And so if you are lucky enough to strike, and Patrick and I know Beto O'Rourke very well, and he is a friend, and we hope he finds success in what he's doing, that's an anomaly in today's political system. To find somebody that can say, I'm going to reject deep pocket or corporate or whatever the special interest money is, and try to find a pathway, that is a challenge. And so perhaps I'm a lesson in that somebody without a political home, without the infrastructure and without the finance. But I also think we're all here at Politicon because we believe there is a way forward, and we're going to find it.
Well said, well said. So let's see, if can be hardwired, we're pre-wired, we have to overcome that. And if we are kind of doing it with our conversations, but we're often not, and our social media can be used for us or against us, our political parties are structured in a way to where there's not an incentive to bridge the divide. Patrick, give us some more bad news. I'd like to understand your take on the related issue, which is about a lot of the infrastructure. I was wondering if you could talk about things like gerrymandering, voter information or the lack of voter information, voting infrastructure, and I mean machines, ballot access, ID requirements, the days and times you can vote, registration calendars, etc., and its impact on echo chambers. And what are your views on whether or not these elements of our infrastructure, our democratic infrastructures, can make districts bluer or redder and otherwise amplify these echo chambers?
Thank you. So when David and I both lost our last elections in 2016, we did an interview together, and we were asked a very similar question to this. Basically, what's wrong with Congress? What got us to this place? And that interview has basically put us onto a tour now. The two of us have been traveling the country, going to universities, talking about what's so wrong with Congress, right? How did we get here? So you hit the nail on the head there, and there's 7 or 8 different topics that we always point to that have put us where we're at. So I'll be quick with them. Number 1 is the gerrymandering. If I had to pick one, that's probably the single biggest problem we have that is incentivizing this behavior. And before I get into all of them, keep in mind these are all related, right? All 8 work together. So with the gerrymandering, dive in real quick. 90% of congressional districts are predetermined right now, 90%. And if you're in one of those safe districts, that's Republican or Democrat, the only election that matters is the primary, right? No one's going to beat you in the general election, a safe Republican seat, say. So how do you win? You appeal to those voters. Guess what the average primary turnout is in a congressional race? Like 15%. So you have 15% of our country determining 90% of our members of Congress. So if you want to win, you could be the most moderate, kumbaya person ever, but you know you got to pander to that 15% who's going to show up. So that's what you do. And then you get elected, and you got to do the same thing. Number two, you can make a good argument, it's the money, right? And that gets to some of the infrastructure, problems you're talking about with so many outside groups of citizens united, billions and billions of dollars pouring into our election system. Then the third is media, and this is perhaps the toughest one to address because we are becoming more polarized, and the more liberal or conservative you are, the more likely you're going to be to get on MSNBC or get on Fox or whatever it might be, or get a bunch of followers online. And the more followers, the more times you're seen, the more money you're going to raise. The more money you're going to raise, the probably longer you're going to be there in leadership, and then you can gerrymander that district and help get into a senior position to help rig the system, perhaps by changing the voter ID laws, perhaps by making it harder for people to get access to the polls, whatever it might be in your state to make it harder and keep you there. And there's basically no incentive right now for Republicans and Democrats in the Congress to work together. And because of the fundraising, we're never there anymore, right? Dave and I were in Congress. We would show up Monday right before votes. Thursday right after votes, you shoot home to go to a fundraiser, to go to a rally, to work on your re-election, basically. Not to go get to know each other, not to go play golf or get a drink or try to figure out, why do you think that? Ted Cruz or whatever, whoever it is you're talking about. And I had an experience where I got to know Michelle Bachmann on a Codell. Had a trip where I got to know her and actually ended up really understanding a lot of her positions because of that trip we went on. And those little things that happen like that make a big difference. And I'm not going to go on CNN tonight and call David Jolly a communist if I know I have dinner at his house Friday night.
It just takes practice.
Yeah.
By the way, I say it just takes practice.
It makes it a little bit tougher. So the incentives now are ripping us apart because you want to get on TV. And how do you do that? You got to say something extreme. You want to get more followers because you want to raise more money. All this stuff comes together. So it paints a pretty bad picture, unfortunately.
It does. It's quite a complicated picture, and we touched on many of the points that are the formation of this. And the formation it comes from a lot of places. So let's start to unpick at this, because nobody in this institution, I don't think, thinks that the direction that our republic is heading with this hyper-partisanship is good for anybody. So let's focus on dismantling that. Let's change that trend. Let's focus on some solutions here. If I can, Dr. Gorman, I want to start with you. And I want to ask, for many people who are in their echo chambers, they argue that, it's my opponents. They lack the facts. And yet when partisans are often confronted with facts, as you know so well, they often double down on their factually incorrect positions. And so my question is fact-checking an answer? And can you help us understand why people cite the need for facts, yet ignore and malign the facts that don't line up with their own viewpoints?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I think part of the reason people cite facts is because, I'm sure many of you have been in these conversations where you feel like somebody else is giving you wrong information and they're believing it, and all you want to do is just sort of shake them and be like, no, that's wrong, here's the real facts, here are the statistics. And I think also many people have probably found that doesn't work so well. And so what you're really referring to here is this phenomenon of the backfire effect, where the more you kind of throw facts at people who are really deeply entrenched in what they believe and really emotionally attached to their opinions, the more they actually may become more entrenched in what they already believe. And it seems kind of counterintuitive, because why are you not hearing what I'm saying? And it goes back to what I said earlier about confirmation bias, where you're the part of your brain that can process what somebody is actually saying to you, and the more complex it is, the harder it is to do this. That part of your brain has already sort of been shut down because you've been approached by this idea that, oh, you're wrong, and here are all the facts. And so you're in this amygdala, this part of your brain that's really, really scared and just putting out all these emotions. That's where you really are, and you're not thinking it through. So you're not hearing what the other person is saying, and you're also coming up with counter arguments. So the more you hear what's opposite to what you believe, the more you're coming up with counter arguments, and the more you're believing your original view. So I think that's really why that happens. And one of the things we often see is that people say, well, why don't we just put in someone's Twitter feed like all the things that are opposite to what they believe? Let's put in all the facts and what we think is really the truth, and then they'll see that and change their minds. And that doesn't work so well, partially because we think that just sort of having that exposure is useful, but it kind of depends on the context and how you're approached with those facts. And if they're just randomly put in front of you, it's not going to necessarily change your mind, and in fact, it might make you more entrenched.
Wow, well that's
sorry to depress
that's
everybody.
upsetting, right? Okay, well then let's take it a different direction. So now, David and Patrick, you had a very unique experience in that you were considering running for major elected positions jointly and from opposing parties. And did you hear people booing or cheering for that bipartisan campaign? And how did your experience through that process inform your views today about bridging divides? I'll direct it to you first, Patrick. Do you think it's more or less likely for us to bridge these divides based on your experience in this campaign?
So when we were thinking about it, it was May of this year, and again, it was a Democrat and a Republican coming together to run for governor and lieutenant governor in Florida. That really hasn't been done. And the thought was, forget the extremes of both sides. At the end of the day, David and I probably agree on 80-90% of the issues. We're gonna go out there and talk about that. We're gonna focus on that, and that 10-20%, we'll get to that later. Let's go get some stuff done. And let's prove to the state of Florida and to the country that our two parties can get along. And it felt really good at the time because we were getting phone calls and emails from all of our supporters back to the sort of confirmation bias, that group of people, yeah, you gotta do this, it's gonna be great, we're gonna help you out with this and that, and we felt really good. In hindsight, I think we would have come in last place. I just don't see any sort of lane for that moderate kumbaya mentality right now in our country, and there's a lot of reasons that I think that have led us to that, but these structural problems that we're alluding to and talking about here are making it much tougher for that to even work, for us to get off the ground. And it was some of those rigged problems, like the money and the media, and the sort of closed primary system we have in Florida, that would have made it very prohibitive for us to even do this and get off the ground.
Well, thank you for that. A similar question to you, Congressman Jolly. So we're curious about this unique campaign consideration. Do you think that campaign consideration was possible, even in your mind, because you're in a purple state like Florida, and that if you were in Indiana or New York, do you think it would be a very different experience? Do you think there was support for this around the country?
I love this question, and here's why. Too often we conflate bipartisanship with the ideology of being moderate. And what Patrick and I were suggesting is that we're not trying to change people's ideology, we're trying to create a platform where everybody has a home and everybody has a voice. And that is so different than suggesting all the solutions are somewhere in the center lane. Because they're not, right? If you take a straight political theory approach, some answers are on the left, some are on the right, and some are in the middle. What we were trying to do is create a place where everybody has a home. And what we found, I believe, is that though people notionally want that, there really is no infrastructure and importantly no donor base, as Patrick refers to the campaign finance piece of this. That is very strategically important from an infrastructure standpoint. So think about branding, right? I mean, if you look at the reality that I ran a $15 million congressional race, Patrick ran a $15 million congressional race, you're looking at the Gillum DeSantis race, the Nelson Scott race, those are $100 million races in the state of Florida. Consider what Coca-Cola and Pepsi and everybody else puts into branding themselves and trying to get you to go to that vending machine down the hall and buy their brand. If we were to try to get somebody to buy the brand where everybody has a home, where it doesn't matter your ideology, but you're safe with us, you need a donor base for that. And the reality is, one of the most ideological and divisive constituencies is the high donor base, right? Progressives are bought in, the very high dollar, billion-dollar progressives are bought into their ideology. The Soros on this side and the Koch brothers on this side. There is not a donor base that says, if Jolly and Murphy and Jolly were to run this race, we'll put in $100 million because we believe in the good of a unity ticket. It's not there. And we can live in the snapshot of where we are politically and say, yes, Gillum and DeSantis, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, we are going that direction. But let's also revisit how we sell unity and how we sell the middle and how we sell bipartisanship. There's not an infrastructure to sell that, and I think that's one of the greatest challenges we came up against.
It's a really important point. I appreciate you bringing that up. So then what can we do? So it's a question for you, Celeste. So you've interviewed not just thousands, but perhaps tens of thousands of people across your career. And can it be that a single conversation, just can one conversation change our perspective? And if your answer is yes, please tell us how we can have those conversations.
Okay, my answer is no. I'm sorry. It cannot. We just don't have any evidence of anybody changing their mind over a course of a conversation. That's not how we change our minds. Interestingly enough, they have started to do some really great research on confirmation bias. There's this great book called The Knowledge Illusion that details some of this. So in one case, they asked a huge number of American citizens, what do you think we should do about this situation in Ukraine, for example? And then they gave their opinion, and then they said, okay, here's a map of Europe, point to Ukraine. And the worse their geography was, and it was all bad. The average person was off by 1,800 miles, okay? The worse your geography was, the more likely you were to recommend military intervention. So, how do you change minds over the course of a conversation? You do not. But here's the good news. I can at least give some good news out of the four of us. The one thing that can change minds is empathic bonds. That's the thing we're not having right now. But you know, there's a famous jazz pianist, used to play with Chuck Berry and a whole bunch of other people, named Daryl Davis. There's a PBS documentary out about him called Accidental Courtesy. And Daryl Davis and his part-time hobby is to convince guys to leave the KKK. Daryl Davis is a black man. He is so successful at this that he basically dismantled the KKK operation in the state of Maryland. And everyone asks him, what do you say to them? How do you convince them to change their minds? And he says, I don't say anything to them. He says, I tell them to talk about themselves. And he says, and this is really important, he says, by actively listening to them, I am passively teaching them about myself. And sometimes people just want to be heard. He didn't change their minds over a course of a conversation. He created a human bond between two people who are not, their identity is not the same as their political party. And this is one of the ways that you can do this, is, you know, if you meet someone who has a Make America Great Again hat on, or a Bernie Sanders t-shirt on, that doesn't mean you're gonna disagree on everything. I often play what I call the common game. Well, I'll say, okay, in 3 to 5 questions I bet you I can find something we have in common. And it's usually like tacos or dogs. But you have something in common with that person. Find it and talk about that. You don't have to argue about the thing you don't agree on.
Thank you for that. I needed that. Okay. There's some room for progress here. So let me ask then about, there's a little bit of pushback. You know, we're here because we think that this notion of bridging divides is a good thing, but there's some people who don't. And my question is directed to you, Patrick, on this point. There's a panel that's coming up later today about why certain communities in America they're beyond the call for civility. They say civility is polite, it's soft, it's ineffective. And this is what's needed in communities that are demanding immediate, aggressive, changes to resolve some really critical issues. They don't have room for this kind of civility. And when you listen to those voices for people who are demanding immediate changes, how does that influence your thinking on civility as an antidote to echo chambers? Is it possible to find common ground and resolve problems with people when you see them as an enemy or an obstacle?
Of course, it's much tougher to do that, but I don't know the psychology of this. I'd be interested in maybe Sara or Celeste's opinion, of course David's too, but it seems, the experts, right? It seems a lot of people like the confrontation nowadays, and not to point fingers here, but just watching some of the interactions in the last couple of days here, people like that conflict. more than they want to go up to someone and say, hey, let's go have this conversation about what we have in common. And when you look at Twitter and you look at any candidate's sort of social media and the comments that are made, very few are, hey, great job, Patrick, really, great job in the environment, what you did to fight for it. It's the trolls, right? That's where the energy is. So I don't know what's driving that, what's behind that, but there is a lot of anger out there, and a lot of people are very frustrated, and perhaps rightfully so, right? You look at the facts of the middle class not having a raise in over 20 years now. You look at the growing inequality in our country. Look at technology. Look at immigration. Look at all these different factors that are leading to a lot of anger and some very necessary changes. And I think this isn't unique to America necessarily, right? You look at some of the elections in Brazil right now, who's about to win the new president there. You look at Sweden and Germany and Brexit and Russia, Duterte in the Philippines. You look at all these examples where the more extreme person is winning, and this sort of authoritarian and populist movement kind of taking over, that show that more antagonistic approach is working, where it's me against you. And that seems to be the fight that's taking place, not this middle ground. There's very few examples of that.
So interesting. Thank you for that. David, if I may, a question for you. Part of the reason you're no longer a member of the Republican Party was over your views on Republican leadership. And I know, Patrick, you had similar concerns that you had with Mr. Allen West. My question for you is about leadership, and what do you see as the role of political leaders in helping to guide people out of binary thinking and into critical thinking? Is it possible? Is it desirable? Is it irreconcilable with party politics? Should political leaders encourage Americans to challenge their ideologies and consider opposing views?
Yeah, so to do so, we have to unrig the system, right? And what I often say this about political leaders is we get to judge them in two kind of different lanes. One is on the personal integrity of political leadership, and that's a fair assessment. And we often don't like to think about that, but the reality is that is our right as voters to determine the integrity of our political leaders, the people in a republic that we ask to give voice to our interests. And then the other lane is the political decisions that they make. And that's where we become, as voters, partisan actors, and we decide, okay, as a Republican, is it best that Paul Ryan does X, Y, Z compared to moving in this direction? I think at the end of the day, either one of those lanes are fair assessments that we get to make as voters. And what I would caution you about is once elected officials begin to look at it from their viewpoint, they become resistant to either one of those judgments. And that's important, right? Because there's a bit of a groupthink that because you're elected and you make these decisions that you are now the leader and you get to determine in that first lane what it is. And then politically, you also get to determine what the right strategy is for your party. I would say this, we have conversations about challenging people at restaurants, at diner tables, Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi, all these things we're seeing right now. I'm not empathetic for any single one of those elected officials. As a Republican who came out for marriage equality and got beat up, I went to the House floor one day and one of my colleagues said, hey, just remember you signed up for this. You asked for this. Every single one of the 435 members of Congress, every single one of those 100 senators, the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, they asked for the opportunity to give voice to our concerns. And if we disagree with the voice that they are giving to our concerns, we get to tell them that. And so, yes, it's uncomfortable to get confronted if you're at a diner or you're at a restaurant, but so be it. If you don't want that life, then don't sign up for it, because somebody else is willing to say, I'll do this.
Thank you for that answer. Sara, my question another question for you. In your book, which it's terrific, Denying to the Grave, I'm struck by the final word of the title, grave. Do you feel a sense of urgency in promoting this kind of critical thinking? Do you think the perils of our inability to consider opposing views and bridge divides, could that be a matter of life and death? And if so, why?
I do actually think that, and I chose that title for two reasons. One is it's kind of a little bit of a double meaning. So one is that people will deny something or hold on to their opinions very steadfast until the end of life. You know, it's like till death do us part with this opinion. It can be very, very strong, and even if it's wrong, that opinion will hold for your entire life, and it's hard to change people's minds. So that was one meaning. The other meaning did have to do with sort of life and death decisions. My field is really health and medicine, so looking at decisions that people make around vaccinating and things like that could, you know, help ward off deadly diseases, that can be a life or death decision. But I do believe that in the policy and political realm, we are looking at life and death decisions around certain policies, like what we do about climate change and gun policy and a whole host of other things. And so the way that we think about these things and our ability to think critically about them is absolutely a life and death decision. It's extremely urgent.
Thank you for that. Look, Celeste, I have a question for you now, and that is, you come from, I mentioned in your introduction, a very historically celebrated lineage. Your grandfather was someone who's very prominent in African American history, and in your book, which by the way is on sale here, and it's terrific, a must read, you quoted Dr. Martin Luther King, and in that quote you said, "You've got to change a man's heart before you can change his behavior." And I wondered, why do you find that quote so meaningful, and how do you think that quote relates to our talk today?
So I think that we are not conversing anymore, we're just debating. And a debate is just by its nature not a conversation. So let me try to get a little bit meta on you. For a very long time, evolutionary biologists and psychologists have been trying to figure out how human beings came to dominate the planet. Because it doesn't really make logical sense. As much as we think that we're smart, and we are a smart primate, we're not rational thinkers by nature. We're not the fastest, we're not the most dangerous, we lose to mosquitoes in many situations. But here's what we have found out. Human beings are the most sophisticated communicators and collaborators on the planet, so far as we know. Which means, if you're messing with one human being, you're usually messing with more. That means that a tiger can't come and drag someone out of our village night after night after night. We're gonna band together, we're gonna rely on each other's areas of expertise, and we're gonna figure out how to defeat that foe, common foe. But in order for that to work, we have to have empathy. The algebra doesn't work without empathy. Empathy, it means that I'm willing to help you even when there's nothing in it for myself. It's not sympathy where I say I feel bad for you. It means I feel with you. And empathy is what we have lost. And empathy is what Dr. King was talking about, that you change someone's heart. And you change someone's heart by finding this common bond that, you know what, life is really tough. It's tough for everybody. None of us get a pass. And all of us believe that we're doing the best that we can. All of us believe we're doing what's right for ourselves and our families and humankind, all of us. And so if you can find that common bond, if you can find the heart of somebody, which completely both transcends and descends below politics, that's how you can then change the way people behave. You have to remind people that in the end we do have a common goal, and that's to make life safe for everybody. That's to give everyone the opportunity to do the best they can. Get out of their way, and when you can, help them out. Right?
So I'm going to try to wrap up what I think we learned today, which is we got to unrig the system, right? We got to create incentives for being able to bridge the divides and make that meaningful. That includes political parties, that includes political infrastructure. We need to have an awareness of our pre-wired disposition so we know what it is that we are overcoming. We need to use empathic dialogue. And that means not just compassion, but empathy, and that's different. And we need to think about people like Daryl Davis when we have those conversations. We need to consider opposing views and consider it with an open heart and with critical thinking in our minds and celebrate our common humanity. Is that for Kumbaya? Okay, so that said, you folks have heard and from an amazing panel, but we haven't heard from you. I wonder if anyone in the room has got a question. Yes, please, in the front row. If you tell me, I'll repeat it.
Oh, she's bringing you a mic.
Thank you all for this great conversation and your great questions. I wanted to ask, as we're at this extreme polarized time, do you think as everything is cyclical in life that we eventually will swing to a polar opposite of where we are now? As it's just a life tenet. So do you think it's possible, or is it the Thomas Friedman school of thought that we have arrived at this point in our history through this technology and everything moving so fast that we're becoming more tribal because we're so fearful of the future? So kind of which end do you think will unfold?
Can I give a layperson's answer relevant to history on this? And it's nothing more than just kind of where your gut is. So what I choose to believe are kind of the patterns of history. If you go back 100 years, every generation we see this disruption. So start with Teddy Roosevelt and the Bull Moose, who was the President of the United States, who said, I'm going to leave and I'm going to start a third party around the 1912 time period. And then 20 years later, we end up in Depression-era politics where we need kind of a strong man, strong executive, strong federal government. And then lo and behold, we say, you know what, we don't want a 4-term president. And so as voters, we say, we're going to enact a constitutional amendment to say we only want presidents to serve 2 terms. And then fast forward another 20, 25 years, we end up in Watergate. And then we end up in the Ross Perot election of '92. Where before he dropped out, he was a viable third-party candidate. Whatever you think of Ross Perot as the person, the reality is we saw this very disruptive chapter in modern politics, and now we're in another chapter. Just David Jolly, personal belief here, I think we're in a window where it's not tribalism, it's not 2 parties. I think there's an opportunity. What we've talked about is there really is no infrastructure right now for that third party, that middle, whatever that disruption looks like. But I think it's viable. And I think in today's world of very high money politics, all it takes is a couple of actors to say, I'm willing to disrupt it in a way that's different than the way Donald Trump disrupted it. And I think we're going to know that in the next 18 months. I really think we're going to know that. And it's one of the reasons we're all here, I personally.
Can I be the doomsayer here? So I look back not at the past 100 years, which is a blip in the history of time, right? But more on going back to the origins of Homo sapiens. If you look back at that, we're not cyclical. There's nothing that necessarily says we're going to swing progressive to conservative. That's such recent history, we don't even have enough of it to know if there's such a thing as a cycle.
But we're living in a modern cycle. I think you're right.
Yes.
I'm agreeing with you.
Yes.
I'm agreeing with you, but we are living in a 100-year
I'm just saying the modern
cycle.
cycle is too short for us to say anything about it. It's too short. I mean, at this point, Noam Chomsky said we don't even know at this point if human beings are a viable species because we're so self-destructive. I mean, we have to choose for ourselves. And to my mind, what we are in is not the cycle of Donald Trump. We're in the cycle of the industrial age. That's where it really started 250 years ago. That's when modern society decided that our views of economy shouldn't be judged by fairness, but that our views of fairness will be judged by our economy. That's where we are. And so I don't see that as progressive to conservative. I see that as just money.
Interesting. Okay, we have a couple more questions. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Spencer. Pretty on the right, I guess you'll say. But my question is, how can you really find empathy with a person? How can you really like understand what other people are going through when you enter into a conversation, and one of the very first things people say because they make assumptions about you is that you're like a racist or bigoted.
Because you're wearing a Make America Great Again hat?
And exactly. So how can you really find empathy with other people when you try to talk with them, across the aisle, when people run into these hot button issues and phrases they want to.
So let's be real here for a second. You're a black guy and you're wearing a Make America Great Again hat, which is totally a right, it is totally okay. But if you want to have empathic conversations, you should probably take the hat off. The same way that you're going to make assumptions about someone wearing a Bernie Sanders shirt, right? Because they're making a statement. It's like the bumper stickers that people put on their cars. You're in control of some of that based on what you choose to present to the world. So if you want to have more of those conversations, leave the hat at home. Okay, that's the first thing.
So can I disagree with that? Let me disagree with that from this perspective. Because I have an unusual path. I've worked with the United States Congress for 20 years. I believe in the United States Congress, and when I finally became a member, I was very disruptive, and I challenged both parties. I really did. I was a person without a party. I was abandoned by both parties. I couldn't find a political home. And the irony of me being a never Trumper is that Donald Trump and I both had the same approach, which was just blow everything up, be frustrated with it, and say none of this is working and we need some smash mouth ability to break down what's currently happening. And so I do think there is a lane of Trumpism politics that realizes the conventions that we have subscribed to are not appropriate to get us where we need to go forward.
But
But that is different. That is different than.
Let me finish what I was saying before, because it might.
Actually, no. Let me finish,
No,
please, if I could. Can I please finish?
No. Because I have to finish what I was saying originally.
No, I got it.
Okay.
This is why Donald Trump won, right here.
No.
This is why Donald Trump won, right?
No.
And I did not vote for Donald Trump, but this is why he won. This moment right here.
Let me finish what I was saying before, and then we can go back to your interruption. So if you want to have
It was
this
not my interruption, but go ahead.
I normally don't wear this hat.
No, this has nothing to do with the hat. I'm an independent. I don't have feelings either this way or that way about the hat. We're talking about how do you have empathic conversations, right? So what you're trying to find is common ground. And you know that the odds are stacked against you. So what you want to do, there's this, I don't know if you've ever read the blog Shit My Dad Says. So he records the thing his dad says. And one of the things that his dad says is actually quite brilliant. He says, if you're gonna have a great day at the park, don't put your picnic right next to the only pile of dog poop. Which means, go have that conversation about something other than your hat. Have the conversation about something else. And then you find that empathic bond. Then you might be able to move on to the politics in a way that has more understanding built into it. Then they will see you not as an enemy, but as another human being who found a different path. Okay, sorry, Dave.
No, I actually don't have anything to say because that proves my point.
Well, you're
I have
saying
nothing
don't
else to say.
antagonize your audience, and I think you're agreeing that don't antagonize your audience is probably a good start. And you're adding some nuance to it, Congressman Jolly, which I absolutely appreciate, because we do need to be able to have conversations with the person wearing the MAGA hat anyways. We need to have both of those conversations. It may be a little tougher, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to try to bridge all those divides. They're all very important. I think we have just about 1 minute left here, and I do want to mention this. So I'm here. This session is called Procon.org Presents. I just want to briefly tell you what Procon.org is an organization, nonprofit, educational, public charity that presents the pro and the con research on controversial issues from gun control to death penalty to whatever you can think of. It's on this free website for people to look at both sides and draw their own informed conclusions. It exists for public consumption. It exists and it serves 25 million people a year. I encourage everybody to go and check it out and to use that information to at least understand what the other side is thinking, because if we can't have those conversations in person, then at least read what the other side says so that we can at least learn what they think and help develop that type of empathy. Congressman Jolly, Sara Gorman, Celeste Headlee, Congressman Murphy, thank you so much. Thank you to our audience. This was a terrific time.